Jai Hind, welcome to Dev Talks. This is Aadi. Information warfare, a term that we see and being used around in strategic circles quite a lot nowadays, especially with our dealings with China. This is a term which is very misunderstood. And to explain this to us a little better, I have with me Lieutenant General Dr. R.S. Panwar, a veteran general from the Corps of Signals of the Indian Army, an expert in the field, I must add. General Panwar has commanded important army unit formations in the field, as well as dealing with communications, electronic warfare, signals intelligence, and logistics. So, before I give my introduction of what I understand about this particular subject and the topic that we're going to discuss today, I'd like to welcome you on Dev Talks to share your expertise about this very interesting and very complicated subject of information warfare.
Thank you, Aadi. Thank you very much. It's a pleasure being on your channel, and I've seen your earlier work. You're doing excellent work. Thank you so much. It's a pleasure.
Thank you, sir. Thank you. So, as I was saying, this is my understanding of it, and the term to me is very misunderstood. We take a lot of information warfare as just propaganda at the very base level of it. It's always, propaganda from an organization. Like we've seen some stuff happening from these big, pharma giants today. But the scope is much larger. It's something that we need to understand as part of the defense of this great nation that we all love. With our adversary in China being a closed society, and for us to even find out where is a simple tennis player vanished, it becomes quite a difficult challenge. And I'm just using that as an analogy for us to understand the closed society or the great firewall of China. Our open and transparent system provides for a huge opportunity for our adversaries to take advantage of the fault lines within India, and there are a lot many, as we all might understand, with the events happening around us. It's either attacks in terms of cyber, it's either attacks in terms of psychological warfare, and so on and so forth. There's a large scope. With the dependence on network, this is a huge vulnerability that we have in front of us. And with your help, sir, I'd like us to understand information warfare much better, for us to, one, understand what is happening to us, two, try and decipher the information that comes out from our adversaries, and three, not fall for the trap that they've laid out for us. To start with, I'd like you to just, open out give us an opening comment about the scope of information warfare and how are some countries kind of dealing with it today.
Right. Before I go on to information warfare, in fact, I prefer the term information operations for this purpose for certain reasons, which I'll probably go into. So I would like to put information operations in context with what is being referred to these days as gray zone warfare, because this is what it is part of. And so let me put it in context. Gray zone warfare, in simple terms, comprises all the means adopted by states and non-state actors in the operational space between peace and war in order to achieve political military objectives. That's a very brief thing. It's not a term which has been defined any formally in any doctrine so far. So there are various versions of it. There are certain features of gray zone warfare which need to be taken note of. Firstly, like I said, it's below the threshold that would justify military response. Activities unfold gradually over time. Then there is this important aspect of lack of attributability, which is not applicable to all subcomponents of gray zone warfare. Then it uses legal and political justifications. That's another feature of gray zone warfare. It stops short of threatening the defender's vital or existential interests. And it is built around non-military tools. Now, these are some of the features of gray zone warfare. Now, if we compare these features and try to relate it to information operations, we'll find that information operations has many of these features, and that's how it's one of the primary components of today's gray zone warfare, which is going on. Of course, there are some other aspects also which I'll not go into. Now that it is, we've talked a little bit about what gray zone warfare is. How does a nation, now we are looking at it from a strategic perspective, from a nation state's perspective of employing gray zone warfare. So how does it go about? So when we talk of a nation and its power, uh, there's something what we refer to as comprehensive national power. Now, comprehensive national power has to be applied in terms of in the gray zone. How does a nation employ? What are these instruments of comprehensive national power? So it's neatly captured by this acronym called DIME, D-I-M-E, where D stands for diplomatic, I information, M military, and E economic. In fact, there's an extended version of it. It's called midfield. You add law, development, and finance to it, it becomes midfield. So they're various extended, but the most popular one is DIME. Now, when we look at DIME, uh, now that's a whole of government approach. DIME is a whole of government approach. So, since we are talking of information operations, let us look at the military context. How do the armed forces fit under the DIME paradigm? Now, in these four, basically military is, of course, armed forces. So that M component of it is completely armed forces. The I component of DIME, there's a whole of nation effort which is involved in that. There is also a military connotation or military component of that I in DIME.
Hmm.
That military component of I in DIME is what we are referring to as information operations. So this is how I wanted to relate information operations to what is going on these days as far as gray zone warfare is concerned.
Very clear, sir.
Yeah. So now let's look at information operations per se. Information operations primarily, as per Indian Army doctrine, there are three components to it. One is cyber warfare, one is electronic warfare, and one is psychological operations. These are the three primary components. Again, you can talk of some other subcomponents, etc., but these are the three primary subcomponents of it. We'll talk of each of these, I suppose, in a little more detail. So now, in simple terms, what does it involve? How do you distinguish between these three? Sometimes, even people who talk about these three, there's a lot of overlap as to what is cyber and what is psychological operations. So how do you distinguish in a very simple manner? As far as cyber warfare is concerned, the weapon is the code. There has to be code. You send in a code, and that's the weapon in cyber. In electronic warfare, the weapon is EM energy. And in psychological operations, of course, I prefer the term cognitive operations for this, which again I'll elaborate upon later. In psychological operations, the weapon is the message. So, for example, if you see a narrative coming over in cyberspace through, let's say, WhatsApp or social media, etc., if it's a simple message coming through normal WhatsApp, that would be clearly psychological operations of a particular type, not cyber, because there's no cyber expertise involved in it. But if we look at let's say something what the Cambridge Analytica did. So Cambridge Analytica, first it did a little bit of a cyber aspect. So that's an integration of cyber and psychological operations, where it used its hacking mechanisms to gather the individual profiles of users. So that was the cyber part of it. And then it sent in messages all over to affect presidential elections and all. So this I am trying to give this example to bring out the difference between everything which happens in cyberspace is not really cyber warfare. Cyber warfare is a particular specific aspect of it. So I've briefly elaborated on these three aspects. Um, so I think from there we can proceed as far as opening comments. I think this we can proceed from here with whatever further queries you have.
Yes, sir, indeed. Actually, as a matter of fact, a lot of people do misunderstand the concept of information warfare and cyber warfare because they feel that if there is a social media campaign which is on for anything, it becomes part of the cyber warfare. But I think what you said is very interesting because you've basically told us that cyber would be the mean of pushing out that information or the message, as you put it across, in part of the cognitive operations or the psychological operations that you're looking at. So my first question would be cyber warfare. We mostly connected with cyber hackings. We saw a bad incident that happened with regards to the Mumbai power grid. It was attributed to hackers within China. The Chinese recently blamed India for trying to hack into their systems and stuff like that. is that it, or is there a larger scope to this whole cyber operations? And how do you see defensive and offensive capabilities of ours within India versus the adversaries that we face today, sir?
Yeah. So it's a huge area to cover. I'll again give a very brief overview of what this is all about.
Sure.
Essentially, firstly, let's look at the different types of threats in very brief. There's a particular reason why I want to bring out the types of threats. One is cyber crime. Then you have cyber espionage. Now, espionage also could be industrial espionage, or it could be espionage at the strategic level against the state. You have cyber terrorism. You have there's something called cyber hacktivism. And you have cyber war. Now, how do you distinguish between them? I think cyber crime is pretty well understood. So also is espionage. Terrorism, few instances are there, so we'll not talk much about terrorism. I would like to bring out really the difference between crime, espionage, and cyber war. Now, cyber war, when I am referring to these terminologies, in fact, many of these things are very definitional, so that must be kept in mind. So, cyber war, I'm referring to as state level, something which has got strategic effects. That is what we are referring to here as cyber war. Now, so far, India in general has been, tackling cyber aspects through the prism of cyber crime, because that is what we normally come across. The example that you quoted is one of the examples which can be taken to be as maybe cyber terrorism, or actually a subcomponent of cyber war. Because if we attribute it to China, it was sort of some sort of a signaling which was happening. So we have been seeing cyber warfare, as we call it, through the prism of cyber crime. But we need to look at it from the defense of national cyberspace. What is involved in that, and what we need to do? That is what is the important part, right? So when we talk of defense of national cyberspace, now here we have to look at what are the governance architectures in place, how we as a nation are handling it today. And since it's national cyberspace, so we are also, we look at a 5-dimensional battle space when we talk of even including gray zone warfare, but all warfare in 21st century, now we are looking at a 5-dimensional battle space. So when we talk of 5-dimensional, we look at land, sea, air, space, and cyberspace. So the traditional 3 domains have been land, sea, and air. And then you have the newer domains of space and cyberspace, right? So now it's also, this is also related to multi-domain operations. When we are talking of defending a nation, the primary charter, as you know, rests with the defense ministry, the armed forces. That's what is the governance architecture for the traditional domains of land, sea, and air. But what about space and cyberspace? What happens there? So today, this aspect is really not being flashed out, or let's say crystallized, as far as the Indian governance architecture is concerned. So let's see what is there today on ground. Today we have, at the national level, at the apex level, we have 2 organizations. One is the CERTIN, that is a Computer Emergency Response Team India, and the other is the National Critical Information Infrastructure Protection Center, that is the NCIIPC. This is an organization which is organizationally with RAW, etc., but actually functions under the PM. Now, this is meant to sort of protect our national critical infrastructure. What are the critical infrastructures? Critical infrastructures are designated by the government. These essentially, I mean, some of the important, there are 6 different areas. Some of them are, let's say, power, energy, finance, etc., and of course, defense institutions. So there are 6 different such areas which are there as designated critical infrastructures. So to protect them, now critical information infrastructure is the protection of the information attacks on these critical infrastructure. So that is what is important from the national point of view. So who protects? Right now, Certain and NCI PC, without going into too much detail, are there. They are actually advisory bodies. They are not really accountable for the protection of the critical infrastructure. They are there as advisory bodies. They do there's certain amount of response capabilities which are built in, but they are limited. So essentially, anybody who's involved in the running of critical infrastructure, and they are not really government agencies. There are a huge amount of private sector which is involved, as you know. I've noted power, energy, finance institutions. They're all run by mostly private institutions. So they are all fending for themselves, so to say. They're all accountable for their own protection, right? So we have to look at how should national cyberspace, where critical infrastructure which affects the security, national security, how should that be protected? So today I told you we have these two organizations. Now let's look at, and of course, we have the Defense Cyber Agency which has now come up. So what is the charter of the Defense Cyber Agency, which is part of the armed forces? So before we start looking more deeply as to what should happen as far as our own governance structures, just some broad ideas, let's look at how other countries are handling it. So for example, look at China. So China, you have recently, I mean, in 2015 or 1st January 2016 onwards, they have raised this PLA Strategic Support Force. Now the Strategic Support Force, PLA Strategic Support Force, is chartered to look after space, cyber, electronic warfare, and psychological operations. Not that there are other agencies not involved, but at the strategic level, the PLA Strategic Support Force has been raised for this purpose, and that's why it is referred to such a potent force. If you look at the US, the Cyber Command was raised in 2010. Of course, to get fully raised, it took almost 7-8 years. We'll come to skill development a little later, maybe, but it took 7-8 years to fill up just about 6,000 odd billets that they had. So that's for the cyber part. Then they have other commands, Special Operations Command. You have, so different commands. You have recently, last year or year before last, the Space Command was raised to look after the space aspect. So different commands look at, but armed forces are involved, and there are organizational structures in place in the form of commands under the DoD. That's how the US is structured. What about India? So India today, as far as the involvement of the armed forces is concerned, we have the Defense Cyber Agency, which is also very recent. It just established in 2019 only. The approval was given in 2019. Even now, it's in the process of being raised. So the role of the armed forces in the defense of national cyberspace is what needs to be reviewed and looked at. The reason being, and I mentioned multi-domain operation. You see, one is the cyber attacks which are occurring in the gray zone part, short of all-out conflict. So I told you many other threat actors are there. Other agencies have to be involved. For example, in cyber crime, MHA is required to be involved in cyber crime and things like that. So what is the role of the armed forces, especially when we look at strategies for cyber defense? One important aspect which comes up is offensive defense. So there has to be an offensive element in the defense part of it. That's true for any type of warfare. I mean, in traditional one also, you can't think of defending your territory without having an offensive element to your aspect. So offense is an inherent part of defending the country, having an offensive capability. And that is one aspect of it. The other aspect is that it is a multi-domain operation scenario, especially if there's an all-out conflict. It's a multi-domain operation scenario. So how does cyber and information operations and all dovetail into the other domains of space and the land, sea, and air? So again, for integrated functioning, there has to be a governance architecture which allows a clean and nice manner or a potent manner in which multi-domain operations can be conducted. So all this points to a role for the Indian armed forces to be central to the cyber defense at the national level. That is the main point which I am trying to say. So I brought out in a very brief manner as to what are the current architectures. We have a defense cyber agency, what the other countries have. And so just as a closing comment here, I would say that there's a need to enhance our cyber capabilities in organizationally as far as from the skill development. So I
Indeed.
think that's, yeah.
I think your point about skill development is very, very critical, and that's something that I think we would cover in the last part of this particular interview, because that's something which will require, it's not just setting up an agency or a command; it's also grooming the entire force to kind of take it forward. That's going to be very,
Absolutely.
very interesting to know how countries have done it. And you also say that the US took almost 6 to 7 years. That's a long time.
More.
Our current, yeah, of course, our current threats are today, so it's going to be interesting to see how we actually handle them. Moving on, so affecting the common man of of this country, I mean, and each country who's involved with this kind of an operations with its adversary, is direct psychological operations. As you mentioned in the opening comments, is cognitive operations. Looking at this, one thing that we need to look at as people who analyze strategic affairs is that how do we decipher this information, whether it's correct, not correct, what's happening, what is the target of this entire thing. And of course, the second part of this question is that social media plays a big role in ensuring that these kind of things become so-called a storm. It's what is called a social media storm. How do we reduce the chances at a national level of fake news, let me just put it in a very simple term, going and becoming a social media storm itself?
Yeah. So, cognitive operations, psychological warfare, so many terms are being used. Again, it's a very complex area. If we look at this complex area simplistically, then I think we are not going to make much progress. So it has to be understood firstly that it's a complex area.
Sure.
So
Yeah.
let me first start by, and another point which I want to make here is that many of these things are definitional, how you define it. So you said it is not psychological operations, it is cognitive operations. It's not that. I prefer to use cognitive operations for a certain reason, which I'll just explain.
Please.
But whatever you mean by a certain term, as long as it is defined in a doctrine, it is clear what you mean by that. If you're not clear, if your doctrines and concepts are not clear as to what you mean by a particular term, then one then gets confused. And organizations also, ultimately it has effects on how you train for it and how organizations are. So we so far. So anyway, I'll just leave it at that for the time being. So let me get on to the main issue. Now, why do I prefer cognitive operations over psychological operations? Actually, under this said, one can group several capabilities. These are firstly, you can call it psychological operations. PSYOP is another word which is used for it. The way I'm using the word psychological operations are operations which convey selected information, not necessarily truthful, to foreign audiences in order to influence their behavior. Mark the word influence, in order to influence their behavior. The second subcomponent which I would like to separate out is public information, what we sometimes refer to as media management. Now, these are actions which are aimed at informing as opposed to influencing. Informing foreign as well as domestic audiences. Here, domestic is also coming in. Then you have a third component called military deception, which includes activities meant to deliberately mislead adversary military decision makers. Military diplomacy is the fourth, which involves relationship building with foreign publics and military audiences. And what I have listed as a fifth component is civil military operations. Now, these are activities carried out to influence civil populace in an operational area for achieving the desired objectives. An example being in the army, we used to refer to as Sadbhavna projects. And these are best characterized as actions that convey meaning. Now, I have listed here five of these subcomponents. There are other nuances of these, different types of cognitive operations. Why I'm referring to as cognitive operations is each of them are functioning in the cognitive domain. And why not psychological operations? Because psychological operations, just the word, the literal meaning of the word, relates to playing on your psychology to play with your morale, etc. Whereas some of these others, for example, media management, etc., they are not really playing with your psychology per se. They may be informing you, influencing you. Military deception has a different connotation. So each of these has got a different connotation, and psyops per se has got a particular meaning, depending on how you define it. So it's better to use the word cognitive operations for this basket of disciplines, and there may be a few more activities like this which can be carried out under the same basket. So that's the first thing which I wanted to clarify, right? And I mentioned the 5-dimensional battle space. So the 5th dimension, that also is a point to be noted, that the 5th dimension we refer to as cyberspace. Now, since this is a initial introduction, I'll not go too much into detail, but really speaking, when we say cyberspace, really speaking, there are 2 other domains which are involved in information operations, connected with information or operation. That's what we're discussing right now, is the EM domain, electromagnetic domain, which is different from cyber. There may be an overlap, but this is different from cyber. And then you have the cognitive domain, which is also different from cyber. You may use cyber means to carry out effects in the cognitive domain, but really speaking, it's a different domain per se where you operate.
Sure.
So this also has to be kept in mind. So so I've generally brought out as to why cognitive operations. Now you talked about social media. How do you decipher and how do you go about doing the whole thing? So now let me relate. There's a new term which I'll bring into the picture: cyber influence operations. What I am referring to as cyber influence operations corresponds largely to the types of things which are happening over the social media through narratives and through an integration of cyber and psychological operations, both. An example of which I gave you, Cambridge Analytica, what they did for presidential elections in the US, right? So this is cyber influence operations. Here again, one can, divide it into 2 parts. One, where cyber is not involved. They are also influence operations carried out through cyberspace. So they are one type of cyber influence operations. Those cyber expertise per se is not involved in this. So they are referred to as cyber-enabled social influence operations. And the other thing is cyber-enabled technical influence operations, where you require cyber as well as psychological warfare expertise to carry out your ethics. So it's why I'm trying to bring out all this is it's a complex field which one has to understand in its entirety. There are other aspects to this cognitive operations which are there. So, for example, when you carry out these campaigns, I'm now elaborating a little more on cyber influence operations per se. There are things called there are various techniques which are the n number of techniques which are involved, which have to be fine-tuned and expertise built in. Some of them, for example, disinformation we are aware of, using of deep fakes, etc., to spread disinformation. That's a very well understood term. There's something called malicious rhetoric, what we refer to through trolling, etc. So that comes under the head of malicious rhetoric, so to say. And there are n such techniques. So there are several techniques involved. Then whom are you targeting? So there are target audiences. So you may target, there's something called general societal targeting, where the society as a whole is targeted. Let's say adversary society, whom you want to target. Then you have demographic targeting, where certain ethnic groups are targeted, not the entire society. Then you have psychographic profiling, where individuals are targeted. That's what was done in Cambridge Analytica. Individual profiles were picked up and they were targeted depending on their likes and dislikes, etc., whatever their profiles, right? So the manner in which you target, I've brought out 3 different ways in which you might, try to target whomever you are trying to target. Then you have something called stratagems. I'm just throwing some words in between to bring out the complexity of this entire discipline. So you have, CIO or cyber influence stratagems which are there. These stratagems include, for example, flooding. Now, flooding means suppose somebody expresses a point of view on social media. You express so many other points of view that everybody gets confused at what is the right point of view. That strategy or stratagem, actually, there's a difference between strategy and stratagem. That stratagem is referred to as flooding. Then I was a stratagem called polarization. Polarization, you can understand what you're trying to polarize opinions by playing on the psychographic profiles or the or ethnic group
Outlines.
profiles. So
Mm-hmm.
there are a number of such stratagems. Now, having said all this, ultimately what I'm trying to say is that if we look at this particular sub area of information operations as something which we can do from gut feeling, sort of a thing, that okay, this is how it should be done. You float this narrative and put an army of trolls and generate some narrative without any formal expertise having been developed over a period of time, and narratives being generated, etc., you're not likely to achieve success. So this entire cognitive operations area is really based, the basic disciplines which are involved are the social sciences disciplines.
Mm.
Again, I would like to make a distinction within information operations. There are two streams, two clear streams which is there. One are referred to as information technical operations, also referred to as cyber electromagnetic activities. This is the combination of cyber and electronic warfare. Told you about three subcomponents of information operations. So the combination of cyber, or the combined effect of cyber and electronic warfare can be clubbed under information technical operations, because the base disciplines are the computer science, ICT, and computer science disciplines involved.
Mode. Okay.
Whereas psychological operations, on the other hand, or cognitive operations, on the other hand, have a basis in the social sciences disciplines.
The other way around.
So the people who carry out have to be from different backgrounds, and they have to be developed as an expertise from different backgrounds. So all this has to be kept in mind, skill development and all, for doing this. And we need to have structures, because if you have to do talent development, unless you have structures in place where the people who are being brought up can be groomed in those and develop expertise, just like any other, just like, for example, infantry, armor, etc. And remember, I'm talking only from a military perspective as of now. This information operations is information operations in the military context. All this which I'm talking about is not from a national perspective, because there are other types of activities which can take place at the national level. They need to take place at the national level. This is only the military part of it which I'm referring to as of now. All these subcomponents we have talked about is not from a national perspective, it is from a apex perspective, but in the military context.
Military domain.
So yeah. So we need to, so in short, you need to understand firstly that it is a complex area of this thing. There are many sub-disciplines involved. Heavy super specialization is needed. We need to have organizations, and we need to have skill development processes in place to develop. So that's, I would say, in brief, as to what we can do about it. This is the way forward.
No, indeed. I mean, you put it basically on a chart for us to kind of take forward after this, and I hope in our future sessions we are able to decipher each one of these concepts, because this is something. I mean, especially when you look at China, they talk about subduing the enemy without fighting, and would be the main mean of their actions towards their adversaries. We saw a very soft takeover of Crimea by Russia, although they didn't go so much into the electronic field and the cyber field, but uh, today, as we all know, I mean, you would be more of a voice on that. Is that the wars have become more expensive, bloody, and nobody wants to actually get their hands dirty. But this is a clean way of kind of breaking your adversary and bringing him down to what you would want to do. But it is something that which is very complicated, as you've been bringing out, and something that we need to understand, I think, fast. So you mentioned electronic warfare, and that's something very interesting today. The scope again is a very wide scope in terms of multi-domain warfare. Um, the I'd like you to explain to us the growing relevance of this part of this segment of this kind of warfare.
Sure. Now, initially, I mentioned a clean way of understanding that when we say electronic warfare, we are referring to using electromagnetic energy as the weapon.
Mhm.
But to elaborate further, that was a simple method to understand. To elaborate further, you know, electronic warfare as a technical discipline, electronic warfare, has got three components. It has got what we refer to as electronic support, firstly.
Mhm.
Now, electronic support is when you passively intercept. Now, their energy is not being used as a weapon, so to say, but through the emanations, adversary emanations, you're intercepting that energy and trying to extract information. So that's called electronic support activities. Then you have electronic attack. Now, when you say attack, in simple terms, when you try to jam systems by throwing electronic energy in a particular direction of a certain power, you're trying to jam systems, the electronic systems which are being used by the adversary. That's electronic attack. And then you have electronic protect. These are the measures that you take to protect your own systems. So, for example, you will not, there are various mechanisms. We'll not go into details. That's the protect part of it. So, these are the three subcomponents of electronic warfare per se. There is also another term which has been used these days. It is called electromagnetic spectrum operations, EMSO. That's another terminology which has come into play, where spectrum management is also a component. To all this electronic warfare aspect, you add spectrum management. So roughly that will translate to EMSO, right? And you also have another, discipline or sub-component, you can say. It's called signal intelligence, SIGINT. Now, how does SIGINT differ from what I refer to as, SIGINT is also intercepting electronic emissions, and in electronic support also intercepting. So what's the difference between SIGINT and electronic support of electronic warfare? How do you distinguish between the two? So really speaking, many of these things are definition. So SIGINT, when you are doing it at the strategic intelligence which you're gathering, is generally referred to as SIGINT. And what is at tactical operational levels, the type of activity that you carry out, or let's say the what will dovetail into direct operations and all, that would be under the head of electronic warfare. But essentially, both involve interception of the electromagnetic spectrum, SIGINT as compared to electronic support. So I just wanted to firstly say, what are the different types of things which are involved? Now, why has it now gaining much more relevance and importance than it was earlier? That is the question which you asked, and I'll try and respond to that. There are a couple of different reasons for it. Now, firstly, when we are saying it's gaining more relevance, let's look at it from uh, uh, the US, from the, let's say, the great superpowers point of view, the US China competition which is there in the Taiwan Straits and Indo Pacific. So when you look at these greater powers, let's look at the US per se. It's trying to project power. It's an expeditionary force. So almost all of its communications is through the wireless means, through wireless media. So the moment you go wireless means electronic warfare comes into place, because then you're emanating, you're dependent on electromagnetic energy. So that's one aspect of it. The other direction to be seen is that as communications are changing, you are uh, becoming more and more dependent on your communications part from bandwidth and point of view. In fact, the integrated, what is referred to as network centric operations. So when you talk of network centric operations, if earlier you were not so much dependent on networks, well, if your networks went down, nothing much happened. But these days, the combat power emanates from net centric. So if it emanates from net centricity, and this is what is targeted, your combat power goes down drastically. So that is the other aspect we need to look at. And you look at all this increasing in the types of communication systems. You're going from 2G, 3G, 4G, 5G, and we are now talking about 6G. Yeah. So everything is getting interconnected. And how are they getting interconnected? Through wireless means. I mean, we are talking of in operational scenarios in general, because like for example, India, to a large extent, because of our own geopolitical situation, we are largely, the types of adversaries we have are along land borders, to the north and the west. The adversary that we have are like that. So to that extent, even landline based communications largely will support us in good stead, will stand us in good stead for our own communications. But if you look at the Navy, for example, or if you look at the Air Force, there we'll also be dependent on wireless communications. And in fact, to a very large extent, and that's why Navy has got the first satellite for its defense satellite has gone to the Navy. It's for this purpose. But so these are the segments which are, the more you go wireless, the more vulnerable you become. So that's the basic point. So now let's see what else is coming into the picture. So we have these two new forms of warfare which have coming into place in the battle space. So one is the militarization of space. So we are dependent so much on space, on the space segment for so many things, for communications, for navigation, and for your missile defense, even ballistic missile, not only defense, for missile your targeting, etc. For all that, you are dependent on space communications, right? So all your long range vectors, etc., they all make use of the space segment. Now, if the space segment is targeted through electronic warfare, so that's why the relevance of electronic warfare. One of the primary means, there are many ways in which the space segment can be targeted. One is, of course, the kinetic means. You just had the Russian, satellite being blown off as a fourth one. We did it in 2019. China did it in 2007, and thereafter US in 2008. So one is the kinetic means, but that's the one which is most frowned upon and not really. The other means are, there are several other means. So one is cyber attacks, which is not EM attack, it's a cyber attack. One is jamming itself through electronic warfare. And then you have EMP attacks also and things like that. So various ways of attacking the space segment. Because of this importance of space segment and the manner in which electronic warfare or electronic attack can target the space segment, including your GPSs. Now, when you're trying to target your navigation, everything is so much dependent on your navigation. Everything is really dependent on automated navigation sort of a thing. So you can target the ground segment, which is not, doesn't involve the space. You're just targeting the receiver end of the GPSs. The other is you're targeting the satellites themselves. So both things. The other form of warfare which is coming into place is what is so popular now has become suddenly very popular, is the autonomous aerial vehicles. That is a drone warfare. So when we talk of anti-drone systems, when we are talking of, especially in India right now, the primary focus is in the electronic warfare related. I mean, the jamming related systems is what is being focused on now. Again, there are many ways of going about it. There's microwave-based affairs, there's laser-based affairs. Laser also, depending on how you look at it, in some way, electro-optical devices also come under the whole realm of electronic warfare. So how do you can't physically target if there are hundreds and thousands of drones which are coming in. It's very difficult to physically, through kinetic means, target them. So laser-based affairs and EM-based affairs is the right solution for targeting the drone-based, swarm-based systems, so to say. So these are various reasons why it is coming to the fore as far as a very great importance of developing expertise in the EM domain or electronic warfare front. And then I mentioned briefly earlier about cyber electromagnetic operations, CIMA, the integrated function of cyber and electronic warfare I mentioned earlier. So how do you integrate? I mentioned cyber influence. So cyber influence operations is the integrated functioning of integrated employment of cyber and psychological operations or cognitive operations. That is, cyber influence operations is an example of that. Whereas what is CIMA, or what I refer to as ITO, information technical operations, but CIMA possibly. So let's say that there is a cellular network of the adversary. You want to target it. How and you want to carry out a cyber attack on the cellular network of the adversary. Let's say you want to do that. So how do you do that? In the first step, you've got to get ingress into this network. Getting the ingress is what would come under the realm of electronic warfare. You will there are certain mechanisms you will follow. So this is not the cyber part. This is techniques which come under the realm of electronic warfare. And then you will, once you got ingress, then you will send in your malicious code, etc. That would be part of the cyber expertise involved. So first you get ingress through electronic means, and then you send in your code which requires cyber expertise, because any code, any malicious code means there's cyber expertise. So this is an example of integrated functioning of cyber and electronic warfare. So there's a matching of disciplines here. Similarly, you can think of fusion of the other part of the triangle. What is left? Psychological operations and electronic warfare. The examples of that, but we'll leave it at that because I think it's getting extended. So this is the entire realm of electronic operations we can cover as an overview, and it's a very important discipline which we need to again. Okay, there's another very important point which I want to highlight here.
Sure, please.
That is that when we look at cyber and psychological operations, they are more skill oriented. The expertise is skill centric, human skill centric. Whereas in electronic warfare, it is sophisticated hardware centric.
System.
There is a skill involved, but there's a hardware. I mean, there's a lot of sophisticated hardware which needs to be developed to carry out electronic warfare per se. So this is one just a statement which I want to make. This is the difference between those two disciplines and electronic warfare per se.
I think this entire thing, sir, the way you brought it out has been highly misunderstood, because we've not really paid so much, so much attention onto the aspects that you brought about integration of these various kind of aspects to create something even more lethal against the adversary going forward. It's something that we must recognize, and you brought it out pretty, very clearly, as to there are multiple examples of these. When you were talking about them, one could actually go back and see the examples across the world that have actually come across. And it's interesting to see that there is a combination of these efforts being put out for a certain, this thing. So talking about China, which is, going to be the biggest pain for us to handle, or for us, or actually the entire world, with the cyber firewall of China, how do you, kind of even start looking at doing any sort of information warfare of any sort within this particular, closed society? Is it always going to be the case that the Chinese will have an advantage over the rest of the world because of their strong firewall? And also, is there a need for us to also kind of look at some way of protecting ourselves with a similar firewall?
Now, it's a very important area which you touched upon, and my views are maybe a little controversial in this area, but I certainly would like to express them. The way the internet started through DARPA, etc., and thereafter. So always information flows of the internet have been considered to be something which should be a free flow of information. That's how it started, and that's how it's developed over the last 3 decades.
Sure.
Cyber attacks having strategic effects which affect the security of nations, national security is involved. These effects have been felt, let's say, in the last 10 to 15 years. Otherwise, before that, it was felt that, okay, cyber can only have a minimal effect. Now, everybody's, changed his views the last 10 to 15 years. The very first known case of which can be classified as a state-level effect was the Stuxnet, where the centrifuges of Iran were targeted, allegedly by Israel and US, but attributably is an issue. So that's how it was done. Then you had Estonia, the Estonia war. You had Georgia, you had Ukraine, and then you had the presidential elections of the US, France, and so on and so forth. So all these aspects have happened. So people have realized, and now when Biden speaks to Putin for the first time, one of the main agenda points is cyber attacks, attacks in cyberspace. And similarly, as far as China and all are concerned, so even Obama, when he met Xi Jinping, this an understanding was reached as of sometime in 2015 that they will not carry out cyber activities at a nation level, industrial espionage, etc., and all that, Sony attacks, and also all that led to that. So it's all now come to the top level of negotiations. It has come now with this sort of a thing happening, and with an exponential rise in the types of cyber attacks. I'm not really talking so much about the hacking part or the cyber crime part of it. I'm talking about the effects at the which affects national security. That means strategic effects being carried out through cyberspace. I see no way in which one cannot have a mechanism at the national level to protect our national cyberspace. So let's look at what China has done. China has put up what is referred to as the Great Firewall of China. So it is filtering out packets as they enter the nation in and out both ways. So there are firewalls at the national level, whichever it is. That's what is referred to as the Great Firewall of China. Now, the other point of view that cyberspace should be considered as a global commons. Now, global commons is a word which is used, for example, for space, for the international, non-territorial, international sea lanes, etc. Those are the global commons where it is free for everybody to use. Cyberspace is being viewed by all sort of nations in that context as of now, right? From the point of view of liberal democracy and so on and so forth, all those value systems come into play. One should not stymie the flow of information through cyberspace. So that's the current attitude, and everybody looks at with disdain over what the types of the Great Firewall of China which we are talking about, right? But now you compare when we are talking of national sovereignty in the traditional domains of land, sea, air, violation of airspace, violation of land, even an inch of territory will not give it. Territorial waters, nobody can enter. So there are clear demarcations, and any transgression into your territory, you're going to defend it right there. But what about cyberspace? For cyberspace, the borders lie right at your desktop if you are functioning individually. Or if it's a firm, then it's wherever the firewalls are placed outside the firm. So individual islands. So it's deep inside our territory. Now it's okay. If it's a private sector which is not affecting national security, some private firm is there, well, they're supposed to look after their own security. Similarly, if an individual is there, he's supposed to look after his own security. Nation will not come to your rescue. Well, it might for cybercrime and all, but otherwise, in general, it's not supposed to be responsible for your security in the sense that it will protect you. But what about when critical infrastructure gets involved, when national security is involved? So we have to start changing our views. That is my view now. We may say whatever about China, but the manner in which cyber attacks, according to me, there is no way in which, as time goes along, nations will not build in their own mechanisms to protect their national cyberspace so that their critical infrastructure is defended through national means. What needs to be done for that? Whether it is just the critical infrastructure which is protected, or whether there's a firewall around the entire country to be as an internet kill switch to be switched on in times of national emergencies. Now that's a matter of national strategy. But there has to be an intervention at the national level to put some sort of the well thought out strategy to defend our critical infrastructure with national players in place. I referred to some of this when I was referring to the role of the armed forces and all. So there are many things. The MHA also has to be involved. Internal security is an MHA matter. So this whole issue of cyber governance is related to this, what is referred to as cyber sovereignty. This aspects has to be dealt with, has to be deliberated upon, and it has to be delivered on globally. It's not just in India, but globally. People have to see. Otherwise, how do you go about it? There's no other way of going about it. So that's what I would like to say on this issue.
That's very interesting. Actually, what you're trying to say is that the Chinese have built up a system. One, they are filtering information going in and out. Secondly, they're also filtering information within their own society to ensure that certain things are not discussed.
Yeah, that's the other aspect. I mean, that's the other
That's
type
an
of aspect.
extreme of it.
That's okay. That's a value system which they are following. But we are
Exactly.
more concerned about they
The
can't
protection.
be at a permanent. You mentioned initially to be at a permanent advantage that okay, they've set up a national firewall, but others are just sitting ducks so you can
Open, yes,
attack
yes.
infrastructure. It can't have this as the effects keep on increasing. Automatically, measures will come into play. That's what I'm trying to say.
I think what you mentioned when we were talking about this particular subject offline, that soon enough, and that's what you predict, that countries will realize the importance of these firewalls, and soon enough build them around it. Of course, not in the grave detail that I was trying to explain about China, that they would monitor internal communication as well, but to try and protect national interest assets, VAVPs and so on and so forth, from these particular cyber attacks, and other forms of this kind of warfare. So I'd like you to close this very, very interesting discussion. I must say it's actually rung a lot of bells, and I made a huge amount of notes here for me to actually research in the night today. What is it that India should do to start in this particular direction? I know you've told us that there are certain agencies working on it. The military has its own agency. The civilian government has its own agency. You've hinted at a firewall that India should develop for its own protection. What else would you like to see happening, and what would be your presumed timelines?
Okay. Okay, fine.
I'm sure. I'm sorry, but the timeline should have been yesterday. But let's look at it.
I was about to say that time is at yesterday. You've taken words from my mouth. But anyway, again, it's a each of these requires a separate deliberation, and what is required to be in each of these several areas which we've discussed today on information operations. But very broadly, the first thing that is required to change is mindsets. When we are looking at 21st century warfare, we have, if we keep thinking, again, I'm talking from a military perspective and also from a national perspective, I would say, that we, of course, we cannot compare ourselves, or let's say, equate our national security scenario with that, for example, of expeditionary forces like the US.
Mm-hmm.
We have landlocked borders, etc., and our adversaries are that way. So the land components, that means the traditional domains of land, sea, and air, are extremely important. There's no getting away from that fact. But the increasing importance, especially in the gray zone conflicts of information operations and also space operations, both these, but since we are talking of information operations, we have to upgrade the importance of this as far as the mindsets are concerned. How are they going to affect the national security? So that change of mindset is taking its own time. Actually, that change of mindset and realization of the importance of this had to be much earlier, and concepts and doctrines developed accordingly. So that's the first step for anything to happen, right? Then, like I mentioned just a little while back, that skill development. When you talk of cyber and electronic and psychological operations, skill development, it's skill based, it's human skill based affairs.
Technical, yeah.
So it's not that you can import equipment and you'll get cyber expertise. No, so a certain amount of technology is also involved, especially in cyber. Certain amount of technology is involved, but that is limited. The more important part is the skill, and that is a very short, short supply skill. So, like I said, the US Cyber Command took 8 years to fill up 6,000 billets. And when we say cyber skills, it's not just any cyber skill. It has to be, I'm really talking of offensive capabilities.
Oh.
That's the highest end of the cyber skill capabilities, which is their offensive at the highest end. So that's what I'm talking about. So it takes years for such skills to be developed. So if we have not even started in the right manner, this is where the focus has to be there, both for psychological operations or cognitive operations and cyber operations. As far as electronic warfare is concerned, of course, we have our own capabilities in the DRDO. Incidentally, we have our capabilities. I'm not sort of downplaying. I'm only saying in this competitive environment, it has to be much, much more than what we have as of now, and the focus has to be much more. That's the type of thing which I'm trying to say. So for electronic warfare, it is, as I said, it is equipment is very important there. Sophisticated equipment to carry out electronic warfare is very important. So it's an ongoing process, but the focus has to be much more than what it is now. And of course, dovetailing into all this is, once you develop your doctrines, etc., the right organizational structures have to be in place. I mean, in such a first introductory sort of a interaction, that's all that can be said, that the right organizational structures have to be put in place. It's extreme. I mean, changing to new organizations, devoting additional resources, it's a trade-off between your traditional, the resources which go into your traditional forms of capabilities and your non-traditional ones or the newer ones in space and cyber. So this changeover, because ultimately, I mean, the limited resources are all limited, so they have to be balanced out. So if you change your mindset as to the importance of one domain increasing vis-a-vis the other, if it is increasing, then the resource flow also has to occur amongst these domains. I'm talking the armed forces per se, because you can't keep on tremendously increasing the resources. That's also not possible. There's always a guns versus butter debate which is there.
Yes.
So this rebalancing of resources based on your convictions as to how much role it is going to play as far as your national security is concerned. I mean, briefly stated, that's how I would put it. And another important thing is the last thing which I'll mention here is about your R&D processes. So while psychological operations, of course, don't require R&D processes, but in cyber as well as electronic warfare, there's a lot of indigenous R&D. A lot of it is very closely guarded technology in both of these. So the R&D process per se needs to be looked at with a much more integrated functioning between people in uniform and the scientists. For this R&D process, R&D development to take place in these high definition areas, the advantage that we have is both of these lie in the realm of ICT, information and communication technologies, with super specialization aspects being computer science and a further super specialization of this being artificial intelligence. I mean, this is the pyramid of technology which is involved in these two disciplines, and India has got strengths in these. Those strengths need to be exploited for carrying out R&D in these areas. So that's how I would.
So honestly, apart from the introduction that you've given with regards the information operations and these various different aspects, I think there are two things that hit me the hardest with regards to strategic interference or a strategic plan. One that you mentioned is the mindset, and we need to get out of this whole thing that propaganda is equal to information warfare, and that's something that you brought out very, very nicely. And the second part that I personally feel that India has a long way to go is civil-military fusion, and that's something that you mentioned, that it needs to be done both by uniformed people as well as civilians. It's not just a singular approach or working in silos in separate organizations that will work. It has to be a holistic, combined, all of government effort to kind of take this thing forward. So, I mean, the definitions, of course, are pretty hard hitting in terms of what they are and what components they carry in terms of the whole operations and the wide ranging spectrum of operations that we see. And the third part that I would like to actually mention that I really, really appreciate is that the the scope or the range of warfare we used to, the traditional range of warfare, land, sea, and air. We are preparing pretty hardcore in it, but when are we going to start preparing for the cyber as well as the space defense, or the space of offensive capabilities that we need to have with ourselves? Firing a rocket here and there, yes, it's good, it's great, we're part of a very elite club, but our expertise within this entire cyber world needs to be much better. General sir, thank you so much.
Important, if I just add, you've summarized it very well. I will just add the last thing which I stated, that we've got huge potential in this country because these are our strengths, and we can really actually leapfrog into the forefront as far as these technologies are concerned, provided we have the right focus. That's how
focus and the direction towards probably a goal that we need to achieve. Because this is a never-ending game. I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, sir. It's going to be one thing after the other. I'm sure right now it's artificial intelligence, and I don't know what's the next, sort of aspect that will come out in terms of technology is concerned. So thank you. I think this is a very well-rounded introduction onto the information operations, information warfare. As I think the viewers would like to call it, but this is a very important uh, part of what we are dealing with today. We face these threats, we face these attacks, we face these challenges day in and day out without realizing that these are part of a larger motive uh, to do whatever our adversaries are trying to do with us, because each one of them has a different motive. So it's very difficult for us to put it in the one this thing. But with the right wide ranging scope of these operations, one can only imagine what the final end result they're trying to achieve. Thank you so much, sir, once again for joining me for this introduction and our first conversation on information warfare or information operations. I hope for a long and many such interactions for us to understand this rather unknown field by the general public and even defense enthusiasts to a large extent. Till next time, sir, for another subject, another day. Jai Hind, sir.
Thank you so much, Adi. It's been a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you.